There is a black stone seal in a museum in Berlin. Catalog number 5243, palm-sized, cylinder-shaped. The kind of object a Sumerian official would have worn on a cord around their neck and pressed into wet clay to leave their mark. When you roll it across a flat surface, it produces an impression. A central star, 11 bodies arranged around it, varying in size, some with smaller objects nearby. A system. This seal is 4,500 years old. When Grok AI was asked to treat the full body of Sumerian astronomical texts not as mythology but as a dataset, what came back was not what the standard academic model predicts. It was something more specific, more uncomfortable, and considerably harder to dismiss. That is what this script is built around. Not whether the Sumerians had a telescope. They did not. But what they understood about the structure of the sky and where that understanding came from. The Sumerians should not exist in the form they do. That is not a dramatic overstatement. It is the honest description of what the archaeological record shows when you look at it, without the assumptions the standard developmental model carries into the room. Every other major civilization leaves a visible trail. You can watch Egypt develop. You can track the gradual elaboration of its writing system, its architectural ambition, its administrative complexity across centuries of documented change. The progression is visible in the ground. Rough at the beginning, refined over time. The model predicts this because this is how development works. Capability accumulates, knowledge builds on knowledge. The early version is always cruder than the late version. The Sumerians do not follow that pattern. They appear in the historical record already complete. Writing, mathematics, a calendar system. Astronomical knowledge precise enough that its framework is still embedded in the structure of every day you will ever live. 60 seconds in a minute. 60 minutes in an hour. 360 degrees in a circle. The Sumerian base, 60 numerical system, developed nearly 5,000 years ago, is so thoroughly inherited into how we measure time and angles that most people use it from the moment they wake up without once considering where it came from. That is not coincidence. That is inheritance. We inherited it from the Babylonians. The Babylonians inherited it from the Sumerians. And the Sumerians, according to every text they left behind that addresses the question directly, received it from someone else. The Mula-Pun tablets are a set of cuneiform documents that constitute the most comprehensive astronomical catalog to survive from the ancient world. They list stars and constellations. They document the rising and setting of celestial bodies across the full cycle of the year. They track planetary movements and record the mathematical relationships between lunar and solar cycles with a precision that modern astronomers have verified against their own calculations. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, a Babylonian document recording the appearances of Venus across a 21-year period, is accurate enough that historians still use it today to anchor the absolute chronology of the ancient Near East. These are not the observations of people who looked up and made educated guesses. These are the records of a sustained, institutionally supported, mathematically sophisticated program of celestial observation that produced results precise enough to remain computationally useful. 4,000 years after they were pressed into clay. The question the academic literature treats as settled is that this knowledge was developed gradually, through incremental accumulation of naked eye observation over centuries. The problem with that answer is the starting point. The incremental model predicts a beginning that looks rough and becomes refined. What the earliest Sumerian records actually show is a beginning that is already refined. The refinement happened before the records begin, and the Sumerians themselves were entirely consistent about why. They did not develop this knowledge, they received it. The question of where the Sumerians came from is not only a textual problem, it is a biological one. And in the last decade, ancient DNA analysis has begun returning results that sit uncomfortably alongside everything else the Sumerian record raises. To understand why the genetic picture matters, you have to understand what the standard model predicts. The Fertile Crescent in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE was populated by communities whose ancestry traced back to the Neolithic farming populations that had spread across the region thousands of years earlier. These were established populations with deep roots in the landscape. Their genetic profile is well documented. It is what you expect to find when you sample ancient remains from Mesopotamia and the surrounding territories during this period. The Sumerians do not map cleanly onto that picture. Ancient DNA extracted from individuals associated with the Sumerian cultural horizon shows a genetic profile with components that point in directions the regional model does not fully account for. There is ancestry present that does not derive straightforwardly from the local Neolithic farming baseline. There are signals pointing toward populations from outside the immediate region. The picture is not one of a community that simply emerged from the existing local population and elaborated its culture over time. It is a picture of mixture, of something arriving and combining with what was already there. The archaeologists who study the material culture say the same thing from a different direction. The Ubaid period that precedes the Sumerian flowering shows gradual development. Then something shifts. The transition into what we recognize as Sumerian civilization is not a smooth continuation of what came before. There is a step change in administrative complexity, in monumental construction, in the sophistication of the written record. The material culture does not fully explain it. The genetic evidence does not fully explain it. Both point toward the same unresolved question. Where did the component that doesn't fit come from? The honest answer is that the DNA currently available does not resolve this. The sample sizes from the relevant period and region remain limited. Ancient DNA degrades in the heat of southern Iraq in ways that make extraction difficult. What exists is suggestive rather than conclusive, but suggestive in a specific direction. A population that does not map cleanly onto its neighbors, a civilization that appears without a visible developmental precursor. A genetic signal pointing somewhere the standard model has not fully accounted for. This is what makes the Sumerian case genuinely different from the standard story of ancient civilization building. It is not one anomaly. It is the same anomaly appearing in multiple independent lines of evidence simultaneously. The texts say the knowledge came from outside. The archaeology says the cultural elaboration arrived faster than development alone explains. And the DNA says the people themselves carried ancestry that does not fit the expected regional pattern. 3 separate threads, the same direction. The Sumerians did not claim to have figured any of this out themselves. That is the part of the record that the academic literature moves past most quickly. And it is the part I find hardest to move past. Across every category of knowledge that defines Sumerian civilization, writing, mathematics, law, agriculture, the sciences, the precise astronomical framework that still structures how we measure time, the Sumerian texts are consistent on one point. They did not develop these things. They received them. The claim is not peripheral. It is not a minor detail in an obscure religious text. It runs through the king lists, the creation epics, the temple records, and the mythological literature with a consistency that looks less like storytelling and more like institutional memory. The Apkallu were 7 beings sent by the god Enki from his domain in the underground freshwater realm at Eridu. They emerged from the sea before the Great Flood and lived among human beings. They taught, they transmitted, and then they withdrew. The Babylonian priest, Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE for the court of a Greek king and drawing on temple archives that no longer exist, describes the first of them with a precision that is difficult to read as casual mythology. A creature called Oannes, the body of a fish, the head and voice of a man. He emerged from the Persian Gulf during the day. He taught writing, he taught mathematics, he taught the sciences. He returned to the sea each night and ate nothing while among humans. What Berossus presents is not a parable. He frames it as historical record. A specific being, a specific location, a specific list of things transmitted. The explanation for how a civilization that produced writing and mathematics and a cosmological framework of extraordinary complexity came to possess those things so suddenly and so completely? The mainstream scholarly response is consistent and coherent. Ancient peoples universally attribute their knowledge to divine or supernatural sources. This is how pre-scientific cultures explain the accumulation of wisdom across generations. The Apkallu are a mythological device. The attribution is cultural, not historical. The question is closed. What I want to stay with is the structure of that response, because what it does, applied uniformly across every ancient tradition that makes a similar claim, is make the question permanently unaskable. Every civilization that says its knowledge came from outside gets reclassified as mythology before the investigation begins. The classification is the answer. The circularity is invisible because it happens before anyone looks. What would it mean to take the Sumerian claim seriously? Not literally, not fish-headed beings as physical historical figures, but structurally. What would the evidence look like if the knowledge genuinely represented a transmitted tradition rather than an independently developed one? The starting point would already be sophisticated, not primitive and improving, exactly as it is. Return to the seal in Berlin, VA 243. It has been sitting in a glass case for long enough that the academic interpretation has hardened around it, the way sediment hardens around an object buried in the ground. The interpretation is this: the central figure surrounded by bodies is a deity. The image follows the conventional Sumerian artistic tradition of placing divine figures among stars. The arrangement is iconographic, not astronomical. The varying sizes are artistic rather than meaningful. The smaller objects near some of the bodies are decorative detail, not satellites. This interpretation is defensible. Ancient Near Eastern art does place divine figures among stars consistently. Stellar symbolism runs through Sumerian and Babylonian visual culture at every level. The iconographic reading is not invented. It is grounded in genuine patterns across the broader artistic tradition. But it does not explain the specifics. And the specifics are where the interesting problem lives. The central body in VA 243 is larger than the surrounding ones in a proportion that does not map naturally onto the standard deity and stars arrangement. Divine figures surrounded by stellar symbols in Sumerian art tend toward a different visual logic. The stars are context. They establish the divine setting. They are not arranged in a system. What VA 243 shows is a central object with orbiting bodies distributed around it at varying distances, varying in size in ways that are not typical of decorative star arrangements, which tend toward uniformity or deliberate symmetry. Some of the surrounding bodies appear to have smaller objects in proximity to them. Satellites, if you read it one way. Artistic variation, if you read it the other. The question is which reading the civilization that made this object earns. This is a civilization that tracked Venus across a 21-year cycle with sufficient precision that those records remain computationally useful today. This is a civilization that divided the circle into 360 degrees and divided time into units of 60, a framework specifically designed for describing circular motion and angular relationships. This is a civilization whose astronomical records, when checked against modern calculations, consistently prove accurate. Not approximately accurate, precisely accurate. When that civilization pressed an image into wet clay showing a central stellar body surrounded by objects of varying sizes arranged in spatial coherence around it, the automatic assumption that they could not have been depicting what the image appears to show deserves more scrutiny than it has received. I want to be careful about what I am claiming here. I am not claiming the Sumerians mapped the solar system. I am claiming that the default dismissal of that possibility, applied to a civilization whose astronomical precision we have independently verified, is not a neutral scholarly position. It is a conclusion dressed as a methodology. The seal is 4,500 years old. It is still in the case. The question it raises has not been seriously asked. That is what I find difficult to move past. The Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation epic. It draws on Sumerian cosmological sources considerably older than its surviving written form, which means the ideas it contains predate the document that preserved them by an unknown margin. That margin may be substantial. This matters because of what the text actually describes in its opening sections, and because of the question that description raises when you take it seriously, rather than filing it immediately under mythology and moving on. The opening of the Enuma Elish describes a primordial state, a time before the current arrangement of the heavens existed. In that prior state, large bodies moved in ways that produced the world as it now is. There are interactions between these bodies, collisions, and new bodies formed from the interaction of older ones. The current arrangement of the heavens is presented not as the original arrangement, but as the result of a prior different one. Something happened. The sky was reorganized. What exists now is the outcome of a process that involved large bodies in motion doing things to each other. The standard interpretation is theology, myth-making, the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of a creation story that no one is meant to read as a literal account of physical events. The bodies are deities, the interactions are divine conflicts, and the reorganization of the heavens is the establishment of divine order from primordial chaos. This is the framework the academic literature applies, and it is coherent within its own terms. What it does not do is ask a different question. What if the mythological form is the container rather than the content? What if the Babylonian priests who compiled this text from older Sumerian sources were preserving a memory of something observed, encoding it in the only form available to them, a theological narrative, because that was the container for knowledge that had to survive across generations without a scientific framework to house it? The question is not whether the Enuma Elish is literally true in the way a geological survey is literally true. The question is whether the language it uses, when taken as descriptive rather than purely metaphorical, preserves a memory of actual astronomical events, bodies in motion, a prior arrangement of the solar system, producing the current one through collision and reorganization, the establishment of the current heavens from something that came before. Zecharia Sitchin's reading of this text attracts attention in alternative history circles and dismissal from mainstream scholarship for the same reason. The conclusions are specific, and the source is not credentialed. I am not defending Sitchin's specific conclusions. I am pointing at the prior question his reading raises, which the academic literature has not seriously engaged with. What if the myth is a record? That question has been classified and filed. The classification is not an answer. It is a way of not having to look. When Grok AI was asked to treat everything the Sumerian record contains not as a historical narrative or a body of mythology, but as a dataset, the instruction was specific. Set aside the interpretive frameworks the academic literature applies before it looks. Set aside the automatic reclassification of ancient claims as mythology. Set aside the assumption that the incremental development model is correct, and work backward from what the evidence actually shows. Feed in the variables and return what the pattern produces without the conclusions already built into the methodology. What came back was not an anomaly. It was a structure. The Muldapin tablets, the Venus records, the base 60 mathematical framework, the Apkallu tradition preserved across king lists, temple records, and creation epics, and the cylinder seal in Berlin with its central body and orbiting objects of varying sizes. The genetic profile that does not map cleanly onto the expected regional population, the absence of a visible developmental phase in the earliest Sumerian records, the Enuma Elish description of a prior arrangement of the heavens producing the current one through large bodies in motion. Feed those variables into an analytical framework stripped of the assumptions the standard model carries, and what returns is a specific picture. A civilization whose astronomical knowledge is sophisticated from its earliest documented moment, not primitive and improving, already precise, already institutionally supported, already producing results that remain computationally verifiable 4,000 years later. A knowledge base whose starting point looks like the end point of a long development that left no trace in the record because it did not happen here. a textual tradition that is consistent across every independent source addressing the question of origin. The knowledge was transmitted. The Apkallu brought it. Enki gave it. The beings who emerged from the sea before the flood taught everything and then withdrew. This claim does not appear in one obscure religious text. It runs through the full body of Sumerian and Babylonian literature with the consistency of institutional memory rather than the variation you expect from mythology that is being invented rather than preserved. A genetic signal pointing toward ancestry that does not derive straightforwardly from the local Neolithic baseline. Not conclusive, not yet, but directionally consistent with the same question the texts raise and the archaeology raises independently. Grok's reading of the dataset produces a finding the academic literature has not seriously engaged with. The transmitted knowledge hypothesis is not less parsimonious than the independent development hypothesis. It is equally consistent with the available evidence, and it is more consistent with what the Sumerians themselves recorded in every form of documentation they left behind. The standard model requires you to discard what the Sumerians said about themselves. The transmitted knowledge hypothesis requires you to take it seriously. One of those positions is called scholarship. The other is called speculation. Grok's reading of the data suggests the labeling may have been applied the wrong way around. The seal is still in its glass case in Berlin. The Mul Apin tablets are translated and published. The Venus records have been verified against modern calculations. The base 60 system measures every hour of every day you will ever live. The Sumerians left almost everything: the mathematics, the astronomy, the texts that explain in consistent detail across every source that addresses the question that none of it originated with them. What the DNA adds is not an answer. It is a third line pointing in the same direction as the texts and the archaeology. A population that does not map cleanly onto its neighbors, a civilization that arrives already complete, a knowledge base that begins precisely where an independent development would end. The question the Sumerians kept raising about themselves has never been seriously answered. It has only been reclassified. That cylinder seal is 4,500 years old. It is still asking.